Today, I'm delighted to welcome Jan-Emmanuel De Neve, Director of the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford, to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Jan, welcome to the show. For those meeting you for the first time, can you tell us a little bit about your background, your research, and your work-life passion?
Well, thank you, David, for having me on your podcast. And so, yes, as you kindly introduced me, I'm Professor of Economics and Behavioral Science. So that gives you a sense that it's not macroeconomics nor trade, but it's more towards the behavioral side of things. And I'm at the University of Oxford, and more particularly at the Saïd Business School. And that will give you a hint at the fact that we're obviously looking at behavioral economics in the context of businesses. And then at Oxford, I've set up the Wellbeing Research Centre, as you noted, which is now a group of about 20, frankly, stellar young, old, and in between scholars, postdocs working on the empirical science of well-being from a variety of angles, including, of course, workplace well-being, which I sort of personally lead, that work stream, but also child and adolescent well-being, and much more. And I think one thing that might come up in the conversation also is that our Wellbeing Research Centre is now the production hub for the all-important World Happiness Report, which comes out once a year, has been in publication since 2012, and for the past 2 years we run the show and fundraise and produce it for the rest of the world to see the rankings of country populations. And so that gives you a bit of a sense, a brief overview of my roles and the kinds of things I'm involved with. And then finally, I should mention, I'm also the co-founder of a charity, which is called the World Wellbeing Movement. And that is, together with Lord Layard, and so ably led by Sarah Cunningham, has pulled together about 15 or so organizations, foundations, and especially exemplary corporates, the likes of Unilever, Indeed, HSBC. We've put some resources together to help put well-being metrics at the heart of both business and public policy. And so we're doing a lot of work generally then, as you can tell, in the empirical well-being space.
Well, it's great. I mean, and well-being is a topic that much of our audience is very interested in, mostly HR professionals, HR leaders. And I think what we're going to be talking about in this episode is actually the connection between well-being and firm financial performance, but also the societal impact of firms as well. So really looking forward to diving into it. Obviously, we're going to be talking about some of the findings, no doubt, from the World Happiness Report that you mentioned. You've also co-authored a book with your colleague, George Ward, I think, who is at INSEAD, Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters, the science behind employee happiness and organizational performance. And for those watching on the video, you can see it behind Jan, and you can see it there as well, next to my book as well, on the shelf there. I just want to also congratulate you on the World Happiness Report. I wonder, how do the insights from the World Happiness Report connect to what you're seeing in the workplace through your research, and why do you think now is such a critical time to focus on well-being at work?
It's a good question, and it's interesting, and for me, it's been interesting as well over the past decade and a half now that I've been working on well-being science, where I've worked both on sort of population well-being, what makes individuals and populations happier, and what explains differences, which is sort of the mission of the World Happiness Report. So we're in that case, we're essentially trying to explain differences in life satisfaction. And as we move into the workplace, when I put on the business school professor hat and the book that you've kindly alluded to, Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters, that's very much then looking into job satisfaction, so the domain of work. But when we explain differences in job satisfaction, or between job satisfaction aggregated across companies, or whether we're trying to explain life satisfaction aggregated at population level, it's a good question you're asking, because we do find some parallels there. And I think the main one is it's essentially part of the Beyond GDP movement. So, for example, in the context of population well-being, most people would think of GDP as a proxy for welfare / well-being of a population. What we find is that differences in GDP explain a bit, but by a long mile, not as much as people expected to explain differences in population well-being. What does explain differences would then be healthy life expectancy, and especially, and this is the link I think with workplace, is social support, a sense of belonging, social connections, trust, the social elements, the social capital in a society or in a community. And I think what's clear in the book as well, when we look at sort of the drivers and the relative importance of these drivers, it's the same thing that gets echoed in the workplace. When you ask people, what is most important for workplace well-being, the satisfaction with your job, what people will put on top is sort of, fair compensation and flexibility. But when you actually run the analyses to see what helps explain most differences between people's levels of job satisfaction, turns out it's the sense of belonging, having friends at work, feeling like you're being cared about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's, again, the social capital in the from the work floor, the workspace, turns out to be way more important than people think. And so thank you for prodding me to this question, because it's something that between these two levels of analysis, we do find similarities in terms of what drives variation in both life satisfaction and job satisfaction. And it's typically the social capital, the social elements, that come to the fore in those instances and have been typically overlooked both in business and policy.
And before we dig into the workplace wellbeing specifically, just for our listeners' interest and knowledge, which countries usually come out on the top of the World Happiness Report? I know it's usually the Nordic countries, I think, isn't it?
True. It's Finland again this year. They took over from Denmark a few years ago. The truth be told, it's quite tight up there at the very top, and it's interesting to actually give you the number. So it's just to be clear, the World Happiness Report is not an index. It's literally, we report back the average satisfaction with life reported by a representative sample in all of those countries. And so the Finns, to name the people at the very top, the average response to the question on a scale from 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life these days? Average response is close to 8, like something 7.7, 7.8 on average. In the UK, it's closer to sort of 6.9 or 7. As is the case in the United States. So a whole point lower, really, than the the Nordic countries. By the way, and at the very bottom, and sit tight, you'll have Afghanistan, who's continued to slip. And the average response to the life satisfaction question on a 0 to 10 scale in Afghanistan is 1.5. So imagine going into an organization or a community asking a representative sample on a scale from 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life? And the average response is 1.5. So if anybody responds to 4 or 5, you already need a whole bunch of zeros to just bring it back down to 1.5. So it gives you a sense that people in these places know very well that they're leading poor lives, poor not just materially speaking, but psychologically speaking. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the differences. So we pick up huge differences in population well-being as measured through these self-reported measures of how people feel the quality of their lives is going. And that's our starting point. So I started the response to this question by noting that we're not an index. We don't produce, even though we're a bunch of high-end academics from different institutions, we don't pretend to know how happy you are, David. So there may be lots of course, well-being is explained by multiple dimensions, and everybody has factors explaining it, from income to social support to healthy life expectancy to all kinds of things that matter in explaining differences between people. But ultimately, you have to ask people, well, are you satisfied with your life? Are you happy? And that's what we start with. And then we use these other more objective indicators to try and explain why they feel the way they do. And that's sort of while it seems obvious what I just said, it's actually quite a step up or step forward, I think, because most efforts, and by the way, this is relevant to business and HR leaders as well, because most HR leaders, just like most indices to try and move us beyond GDP, they sort of mix and match inputs and outputs into like a dashboard type approach with 7 dimensions, 12 dimensions, or 17 dimensions like the SDGs, or many more KPIs. But there's sort of no conceptual structure or hierarchy. And as a result, you've got sort of, say, 7 dimensions, some of which are going up, some of which are going down. We don't get an overall sense for how people are generally doing. Are we getting better? Are we feeling better as a population, as a business, or as a world community? And these sort of dashboards don't give you that sense, an overall sense of how we're doing. Mix and match inputs and outputs. But then also, if you're a business leader or an HR leader, ultimately you have to make decisions about where to spend your money, which is typically a limited budget. Money doesn't fall from the tree. And so you have to, say if a CEO gives you, David, as say CHRO, $1 million extra this year to spend on improving workplace well-being, where do you spend it on? And in a classic sort of dashboard approach with, say, 10 indicators, there's no way, unless there's a conceptual hierarchy with an outcome, a KPI, and then drivers, you cannot have, you would end up technically probably splitting your $1 million in 100,000 on each one of your 10 indicators. Whereas the reality is, in your organization, some things will matter more than others. It could be fair pay or flexibility or belonging or trust or managerial support or learning. And so that will change from individual, between populations, between organizations. And so you need that conceptual hierarchy to have a criterion, I think, in the language of philosophy, but in the language of econometrics, you need something on the left-hand side of the equation, the y, the dependent variable, that needs to be explained by the variables on the right-hand side of the equation, x1, x2, x3, x4, in order to be able to derive a weight, a coefficient, the relative importance of these drivers. And I think that's one of the things. So in the book, we go on and on and on and on about making the case to sort of take the next step and make a conceptual split between an outcome like job satisfaction and a driver such as compensation, trust, learning, flexibility, the kind of actionable drivers that you should be working on, but that each feed into an overarching notion of how people feel at work. And that's what we're trying to drive. But if you don't make that split, then the puzzle doesn't come together.
Yeah, and I think from what we've seen, that can be a challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations, but certainly a lot of HR leaders and professionals. They don't necessarily connect it, as you said, to the outcome that you're trying to drive. And yes, for example, it's great to improve engagement, but why? What are the outcomes that you're trying to get from that? So they're really interesting. Now, let's continuing with workplace wellbeing. You've crowdsourced, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've crowdsourced insights from over 25 million workers through the partnership that you have with Indeed, which is impressive to say the least. What has this scale of data taught you about how people truly feel at work, and what patterns or surprises emerge?
Yeah, thank you, David, for raising it. It's just been an extraordinary partnership with Indeed, starting in late 2019. And they've got millions and millions and millions of people going to their website each month. And so a handful of those get nudged into responding how questions. And to be precise, the outcome indicators would be job satisfaction, we've raised it, but also, are you happy at work? Are you stressed at work? Do you find purpose and meaning in the work you're doing? And these we consider sort of outcome questions. And then they also get answers, or we get answers, and they get asked questions around a whole host of drivers, like the ones we mentioned: flexibility, pay, belonging, learning, managerial support, you name it. And we're nearing 30 million. It's just an extraordinary high-frequency source of data. The main insights are, first and foremost, and this is good news for the data scientists, is that there's a lot of variation. And so these questions are being asked on a 1 to 5 scale. And what we're finding out there is that there's organizations where the average work well-being score, which is the average of the 4 outcome indicators, is over 4 out of 5. And then there's organizations where it's not even 2 out of 5. And then somewhat surprisingly, you find these distinctions even within industries. And so, say a well-known and even so, my favorite example of this is in the hamburger industry, because it's an industry where people kind of do the same thing, flipping burgers, selling them, serving, cleaning, etc. And yet you'll find a very well-known hamburger chain doing 2 points lower on a scale from 1 to 5 than In-N-Out on the west coast of the US, which is sort of at the top of this. And so this raises the all-important question. And okay, so if we're finding huge differences, even within industry, what explains these differences? And it goes back to the point we just raised earlier, which is you kind of need then these driver structures to help you explain what is the relative importance of pay, of belonging, of flexibility policies, of trust, of learning and managerial support on the job, and explaining why In-N-Out is so much better than some of the big names in the industry, for example. We find these differences across every industry. So that'll be something I know we'll probably get into. The other big finding is, actually maybe a sub-finding of what I just mentioned, is also there's so much data here for the large companies, the Walmarts, the McDonald's of this world. We've got tens of thousands of responses over time coming in every day. And it allows us to also slice and dice by region or even by warehouse or plant. And what we're finding, I think at this point, we probably have a better view on the well-being of workers at Walmart than Walmart does itself. And so what's extraordinary here is that you find big differences even within an organization. So I noted from the beginning we find big differences between organizations, even within industries, but even within companies, the large ones where we have so much data, you find big differences. And so I think the meta point that I like to drive home every time when I speak about this is, let nobody tell you it's not possible to improve workplace well-being, because even in a tough industry, in a tough area or region of the world, or even in a company that may not be known to be associated with much workplace well-being, you'll find plants, warehouses where they do have 3.5, 4 out of 5 on average in terms of workplace well-being. And so would make it to the top half or even the top quartile. And so that to me is a big point to raise. Mm. The other big point, David, and this is a bit sad, is now obviously these are the crowdsourced data through Indeed, so there's some selection bias, and we can talk about that if you want. But even controlling for some of that, we find that only a quarter of respondents, or just shy of a quarter to be precise, is actually reporting 4 or 5 out of 5 on average. And so that means that 3/4 of the workforce are sitting in a 1, 2, 3 out of 5. And so that gives you a sense now, which that's an arbitrary cutoff, like people responding 4 or 5, but businesses like to have sort of like these percentiles. So it does give you a sense, and it aligns with some of the other research we're seeing by our friends at Gallup, engagement figures that are also pretty appalling. Typically about 18 or 20 or 22% of people are actively engaged, and a whole chunk is actively disengaged. And so this mirrors or echoes this, but I think on a grander scale. And so I think that's a call for, like the alarm bells should be sounding. And especially in light of what we're going to be talking about later, where we find these links between how people feel at work and their productivity, the retention of this talent, and also obviously also a good workplace you become a more attractive employer in the first place, which also has its downstream consequences on P&L. And so I think the fact that there's so much room for improvement on workplace well-being, clearly, the fact that it is possible to raise workplace well-being and let nobody tell you it's not possible, I do think that these are some of the key meta insights coming back from this massive world's largest study in workplace well-being, thanks to the partnership with Indeed. And that's probably a good starting point, I think, for more insights in our discussion now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's back to one of the earlier discussions we had around why is it so important now? And I guess it's so important now because studies like yours, data from companies like Gallup, as you mentioned, they show that engagement and well-being, isn't particularly high. It isn't high. If you look across the board, yes, of course there are companies where it's a lot higher. And you said if they can get higher, why can't other companies? Or why can't the same company in different parts of the world? And if we think, and we're going to talk about what's happening globally later and how that potentially impacts or not. But when we think about everything that's happening at the moment, but we also think about the technology revolution as well, there's a lot of things for companies to think about as it relates to well-being and experience. And we'll obviously talk about how that connects to potentially business performance and other key outcomes as well in a minute.
David, if I know you probably there's a whole set of questions you want to get through, but there's one thing, building on what we just talked about, this sort of raising alarm bells about there being so much room for improvement on workplace well-being. And that then, I think, one of the big things for me over the past decade or so, especially when we're starting to look through the book, is that, well, for most of us, probably listening on this call, well, it seems intuitive. Of course, workplace well-being is important and we should invest in this, et cetera. So the human case for investing is obvious. And then, yeah, it begs the question, why is it that workplace well-being is so low? And then you hear every CEO of every company talking about themselves as a great people manager and people are my biggest asset and you name it. And I think we need to become a bit more, not cynical, but realistic around this. And so in a survey that we were allowed to advise on for HBR with that crowd of respondents, we asked questions around, okay, do you think improving workplace well-being can be a competitive advantage? And guess what? 87% of people have responded said, yeah, workplace well-being is a good thing for business. But then deeper in the survey, we plugged questions around, like, what do you prioritize in certain situations and rank order stuff? And guess what? Workplace well-being was sort of deprioritized by most senior leaders, and only about a third would actually have it as a strategic priority. and then sit tight. Only half of that third actually had actions in place against the strategic priority. And so I think combine the fact that there's a lot of people, senior leaders talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. There's low workplace well-being, but there's room for improvement, and it can be improved, and we've got proof of that. I think that it's that combo of elements that are really, really critical to dig into more generally, or at least push us to think about the business case. So the thing that I've become, there's a moment when George and I should not have had to write a book called Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters. It's sort of like, of course it matters, and for all the good human reasons. We are human beings. We all care for each other. We spend God knows how much time while at work, and at work should be a place where we sort of care for each other. And yet most people, or 3/4, report being unhappy. And so that's a real issue. And I think it's a larger policy issue as well, of course. And but given that it's not happening, the improvements for their own natural reasons, I think that's the reason why, in a way, we have to push, and we'll obviously discuss about it next, the business case. And so that's been essentially the core of it was sort of an epiphany. Like George and I and the rest of the team, we've been working so hard on this for the past decade, this business case stuff. And there was this moment in Miami earlier this year where I was sort of walking around having a jog, and I was like, why did we have to spend 10 years of our working lives really digging into the causal evidence for the links with productivity and performance? Like, shouldn't that be natural? And sort of like, and then, anyway, so now I do want to point it out that it's a bit sad, but we have to.
Yeah, we're going to get into that now, and actually, it's interesting. I think there's definitely a gap between the words of certain CEOs and maybe their own beliefs on how good they are or not at workplace wellbeing, and then the actions, the reality, and the behaviours, and we can get into that in a minute. So when it comes to impact, you've spent over a decade looking at this. What does your research show you about how workplace wellbeing links to business outcomes like productivity, recruitment, retention, even financial performance?
Yeah, well, you got to make an important distinction there. So, and we've only come at this. So in our research, we've looked at these different elements over time, and only after a while it became clear to us how this is all coming together. And so you should know that the improving workplace well-being leads to different behaviors of your workers. And the most immediate one, the one that took us the longest to prove causally, is productivity. So David, if you feel better this week, generally speaking, you will be performing better this week in your organization. And that's sort of a first major pathway to performance. And we can talk about how we got there. We worked with British Telecom. It took us 10 years. We leveraged different weather around the call centers where these call center employees were coming in as a natural experiment to sort of manipulate their moods one week to another, combine that with the architecture of these call centers and the exposure to light to try and have a natural manipulation of their mood from one week to another, to then see how that sort of cascades onto their performance. What we're finding there is, and this is the headline result from the productivity piece, is there's about, and it's really a lower bound estimate, but it's sort of a 12% increase in heart weekly sales from a standard deviation change in their well-being, how they felt from one week to another. And that's lower bound. We have for tasks that require more social and emotional intelligence, the impact was greater. So if when the tasks that are more complex in nature, like a disgruntled customer calling in, and you have to try and retain their business, potentially even upsell them, that's when how you felt that week mattered a lot more than just taking calls that were just order taking, where there was no social and emotional intelligence. So it's maybe an argument or something for later in discussion is that in the future of work, what's going to be left to us humans to do is the kind of work that requires social and emotional intelligence, elements of creativity. And that's precisely where how you feel today or this week matters more, obviously, than in the events of when it's just order taking or something more mechanical, which machines will end up doing anyway. So that's pathway to performance one, is sort of like that productivity link. The second pathway is essentially retention. Very intuitive, but David, if you're feeling good at the company or better, you're more likely to stay. Duh. But we've been able to show this to an extent never shown before across all organizations. We have the average sort of workplace well-being, and then we have data on the annual voluntary turnover of those companies each year, and you find a big difference. Like companies with high workplace well-being, so where the average is around 4 out of 5, with reference to earlier, we find that those companies have a third less annual voluntary turnover. So that's talent that's leaving that you didn't want to leave. And that's at a rate of 30% more than companies with high turnover. So companies with 4 out of 5 on average have 30% less annual voluntary turnover than companies with low workplace well-being. That's the second pathway. And then the third pathway is talent recruitment, attraction. And this is really exciting. We noticed, our friends at Indeed, when the work well-being score was being rolled out, there was an A/B test. So there was staggered rollout, which allowed us, and George did all the work on this, but an extraordinary study which became his MIT PhD thesis. And again, sit tight, but we were able to randomize, I think, 23 million job seekers. 23 million job seekers were randomized into either seeing work well-being scores for an organization they were thinking about applying to, or not seeing it, and just seeing the usual, like job description, the company name, and the salary attached to it. Lo and behold, when people see more information about the non-pecuniary, the non-monetary elements of working there from the horse's mouth, so if there's sort of this company is actually the top half or the top quartile, high workplace well-being, job seekers start responding to this. So their behavior starts changing. And it's not massive, but they were less inclined to apply to low workplace well-being companies. So the treatment group, the people who saw the usual job ad, job description, pay, but also the work well-being score, and if it was low, they were less likely to apply. If it was top or like top quintile, or top quartile, they would be more likely to apply. And so this is the third pathway to performance. While the impact may not be immediate on performance or profitability or your P&L accounts, over time, you becoming an employer of choice and people wanting to apply to you is a big deal. And actually, I'll give you a specific number on this front. The work well-being score is a number that runs on 100, the way it's publicly advertised, even though it's surveyed on a 1 to 5 scale, but ultimately sort of a score out of 100. What we now find is for every point increase in a company's work well-being score on a scale to 100, we find a 1.3% increase in applications for the job. And that may not sound like a lot, but it is a lot if you add it all up, 1. And 2, the additional applications that are coming in are probably the ones you want to come in, because these are the people who are more selective, who are thinking twice about applying and are more select in where they put their CV forward. And so this matters. So if you become an employer of choice. So there's the 3 pathways to performance. But I haven't actually, this doesn't make up a business case as of yet, because these are just the benefits of workplace well-being. So if you can improve workplace well-being, there'll be more productivity, you'll keep your talent for longer, and you'll become an employer of choice, and so your talent attraction or recruitment will be better. But these are just the benefits of well-being. They don't bring into the picture the cost side. So what is it? And so if you have so I could have told you, like BT, British Telecom, we find a 12% increase in sales for a big change in well-being of these call center employees. But a cynical CFO, of which there's many around, would say, all good and well, I believe you on the numbers, and fantastic that Oxford has been able to show causal evidence for the link between well-being and productivity. But how much will it cost me to move the needle on well-being by a whole standard deviation change? So say from a 3 to a 4 on a scale to 1 to 5. Maybe it'll cost me more than a 12% gain in productivity and sales. And so the only way to try and get both the benefits of improving workplace well-being as well as the costs, well, there's 2 ways. One is to literally look at intervention by intervention and see, like, okay, what will it cost me to improve workplace well-being through intervention X or Y, whether it's coaching or this training or mindfulness apps or wholesale change in compensation packages or benefits. But then you'll get the ROI on a specific intervention to improve workplace well-being. So what we were after is like, wait a second, we may not have the specific costs of an intervention and the attached well-being and productivity gains. What we could do is look holistically at an organization's P&L and look at differences between the well-being of some company versus another company and see whether they do better financially in terms of profitability. While we may not understand what these companies did to improve workplace well-being, but they must have done something to have an average score of 80 rather than, say, 70. And so whatever they did to effectively raise workplace well-being, it must have cost them something or nothing, but they did things that have a positive impact on their well-being. Does it pay off? So do the benefits of high workplace well-being outweigh whatever it cost them to get a higher score? And that's the big study that we then set out to do. We leveraged the extraordinary Indeed data source to then, for all the major corporates, we first and foremost focus on all the listed companies, because there you've got these wonderful sort of quarterly, systematically analyzed sort of financials that give you a sense of profitability, both profit and loss, our revenue and costs coming together into profitability. And what we found there was really extraordinary. So whether it's book value or return on assets or actual gross profits in billions of dollars across all of these listed companies, this is sort of 1,800 amongst all the biggest ones. Any company in America that's listed that you can think of, it will be included in the study. And what we're finding is big differences. And so, for example, at the top of my head now, but companies that sort of have an average of 4 out of 5 on workplace well-being, so the top quartile, their average gross profitability is something like 6 or 7 billion, where annually. Whereas those that are more like 2 out of 5, it'll be more like 2 billion or 2.5 or something. So you start seeing very raw sort of data around correlational, admittedly, between where companies are able to effectively raise workplace well-being, they financially do better. Now, I just mentioned the correlation bit. Obviously, you could say, well, maybe it's because there's better financial performance that they can invest in workplace well-being. So you will have gotten the same questions, David, and any senior HR folk dealing with CFOs and CEOs will get this question: chicken and the egg.
Yeah. Is it performance driving perceived well-being, or is it the other way around sort of thing? Yeah.
Precisely. And so the beauty is, I think, on the individual pathways to performance, the productivity, retention, recruitment, we now have causal evidence. We've been able to disentangle the dynamic directions running from performance onto well-being and well-being to performance. So there we have causal evidence. There's nobody can attack us on that front. But on the business case, the larger sort of performance, it's hard to manipulate. You can't sort of do experiments and put some companies into well-being intervention and others not generally, and then see what happens. So that's not quite possible. So the best we can do is move towards sort of longitudinal evidence, where we see is historical levels of workplace well-being, say how come the well-being of companies in, say, 2021 or 2022, is that predictive of financial outperformance in 23, 24, 25. And so that's the kind of stuff that we set out to do, and that's what we're finding. So we're using, for example, the work well-being scores of the big companies that are listed in 21, 22, and you sort of see that continues to predict financial performance of the profitability kind years out. And that's one study. And then in line with that, the final study, and sorry, I'm on a bit of a...
No, this is good stuff. And I know the people analytics people listening will be loving it. So.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you, David. Well, but I'll finish on this, which is a study that got so much attention, and placed to this, the longitudinal aspect, is the stock market study. So now that we've got comparable data for all the big listed companies in the US, it begged the question, obviously for us about 3 years ago, wait a second, if we believe in this business case, why not invest on this? And so we did this portfolio as an exercise where we leveraged the old data. So we sort of backdated this first, obviously. We've got data from 2019, 2020, which is the first full year. And so, let's use the 2020 data, rank order these 1,800 or so companies that we've got data for, listed them on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, and just take the top 100, but you can take the top 50, top 20, and the top 200, whatever. But top 100, work well-being top 100, and let's invest in those because they're doing great for their people. Let's see if that also pays off in future stock market performance. And so on January 1st, 2021, we invest in $1,000 in the top 100 based off the 2020 data, historical data, and then go to bed for a whole year, wake up on January 1st, 2022, to see how we did, and then rejig the portfolio a little bit and just about typically there's about, sort of out of the top 100, there's typically about 20 companies that sort of drop out of the top 100 because of the new data. And then so they get replenished, and there's a bit of new blood coming into the top 100. So there's a bit of change, but not fully, of course. Some companies keep doing very well for their people, and people tell us so. And so what we're finding is, both in the bear market, in the bull market, and the volatility, overall, right now, our portfolio of just investing on best places to work from the horse's mouth through this crowdsourced survey and across all companies, we're at, I think, $1,600, whereas the S&P is at $1,500 and NASDAQ is sort of $1,400 something. So there's meaningful predictive power, and not just, but outperforming. Because obviously good companies will have been already highly valued, but still there's something extra in there that is not fully, the work well-being, so it pays dividends over time that are not fully captured nor anticipated by the stock market. And that's exciting, of course.
That is exciting. And I guess, and again, it's not just firm financial performance. I know in the book you talk about societal impact, which obviously is a big focus for many firms as well. It's not just benefiting your employees. I guess it's benefiting some of the ESG or CSR targets that companies are setting themselves, but actually to benefits potentially the communities where they exist effectively, or where they're based.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's sort of, if you think of this more from an ESG angle, obviously environment has gotten a lot of attention, governance standards as well. I think the little kid here, or the one that's gotten the least attention, is the social impact. But in part, truth be told, it's hard to measure. Like, what is the social impact of organizations? And obviously they have their stakeholders, from clients to the local communities where they operate, to, I think, the one where we can most easily, quote unquote, measurably measure the social impact is obviously with the employees, because those are the human stakeholder who is probably most touched by the organization, because that's the people you're dealing with day in, day out, from 9 to 5, if not much more. And so I think these workplace well-being scores are not the whole picture on the social impact of an organization, but a big chunk of it is captured. And so if we put a spotlight on the S in ESG, then I think these workplace well-being scores should pick up a big chunk of the positive social impact that an organization can have. And that really starts with employees and then moves on to the local community and clients. But I think that's an important element. And I know there's the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB. We've submitted material there to see, like, hey, can you use these crowdsourced data a la Glassdoor and Indeed to sort of try and measure the S and ESG of companies from your accounting perspective. Very excitingly, another development where this was picked up is S&P Global, who arguably probably have the best sustainability ratings of companies. And they do this by way of a survey that they send out to all the major corporates around the world, who then have to respond to questions around E, S, and G, and that then informs the sustainability rating that S&P attaches to these big corporates. And I'm so proud to say that the leadership at S&P Global, in the S section, measuring the social impact of organizations, there's now a section called Trends in Employee Wellbeing. And you will have guessed which questions they're asking. They're saying, are you measuring workplace well-being? And if so, are you measuring the big four: job satisfaction, work happiness, stress, and purpose, to get like that holistic indicator for how your people doing. And that's really exciting. And so that partially informs now the ESG/sustainability rating of these corporates. And that's important, because the reason why I'm so proud of it, and so I think it's so impactful, is because big CEOs, they have a lot of their comp attached to how the stock is doing. And a lot of the stock is moved by pension funds or retail investors or ETFs that are linked to sustainability ratings. And those typically are put forward by S&P. So say a BlackRock or a major pension fund. If people suggest, okay, I want my pension savings to be invested in ESG, like screens on ESG and sustainability, then some companies will be part of these packages and others will not. And so you as a CEO, you want your company to be highly investable as part of these ETFs and pension funds and sustainability funds and what have you. So the fact that you have, say, wonderful workplace well-being, and that gets picked up, then it will help you on the S front in ESG, which will get you a better rating, which will make you more attractive stock to invest in for a variety of retail and institutional investors. And that's exciting stuff, and that's good. And I think that then nudges these sort of more otherwise skeptical or cynical C-suite folk into saying, oh, okay, so if I become more investable as a result of doing good, or if by doing good I do well, that's when it really clicks.
You mentioned earlier about this phrase we always hear from CEOs and business leaders: our people are our biggest asset. And obviously, there's evidence that you've just talked through, and there's other evidence that suggests that workplace well-being correlates positively with company performance. So why does two-part question is: firstly, do you think well-being is still treated as an HR nice to have? And then maybe as part of that, why do relatively so few CEOs invest more in employee happiness and well-being initiatives? Just your thoughts, really.
No, it's a very good question. One that we go on and on at length in the book. So thank you for raising it. Yes. So in a way, back to the very start of our conversation, once you make that conceptual split between sort of measuring how people feel at work, generally through, say, job satisfaction, and then look at what might drive it, then you quite quickly get into thinking more holistically around workplace well-being, and not just sort of individualistic interventions typically associated with HR wellness, perhaps packages such as mindfulness apps, like proposing yoga or health checks and these kind of things, which are very individual focused. But what you find when you do these driver analysis is that the relative importance of the more structural, environmental, social aspects actually weigh in more into how people feel at work and thus drive their performance and productivity, what have you, as do these individualistic elements. And I think we're moving away. So our friends, Andrew Gibbons, who's a global head for wellbeing at HSBC, who's absolutely brilliant, he's coined this notion of, okay, we're moving from wellbeing 1.0, playing whack-a-mole with wellness interventions. So, we want this, we want that, and he sort of throws stuff at people and see what sticks. So sort of wellbeing 2.0, which is more evidence-based, trying to actually get into the data, what actually drives well-being more structurally, and trying to put your money where it will have where it will make a real difference. But that does mean, this goes to your question, it means that the HR function is going to have to play more of a bridge building role, and because a lot of the more structural interventions that will really move the needle in workplace well-being will have to do with work culture, ways of working, bureaucratic elements, red tape. People get frustrated. They're not at their productive best because of XYZ policies. Pay, which is not necessarily within the domain of HR, but so CFO suite, culture and sense of belonging, and it comes right from the top to the CEO. And so there's a lot of stuff that actually helps explain how people feel at work that is outside the scope or the remit of your traditional HR function. And so I think you've got this notion of chief HR officers become chief people officers. And so you see some companies have adopted that language. I think that's a good move. It's also indicative of the fact that they are then speaking on behalf of people, and then they need to work with the CFO, the CEO, the chief operations officer to talk about, okay, ways of working, making it easier on people to do what they need to do and feel productive, bullying culture, or belonging, where pay, and so there is a move. I think the wellness industry is great, and they do a lot of good, so nothing against, but there's a beyond wellness element, beyond. I shouldn't pick on wellness. It's more like beyond the individual.
Yeah.
So at the moment, people think, well-being is you, David, and I'm going to try and improve your well-being by throwing yoga and mindfulness apps at you. But they forego the fact that a big chunk and the co-responsibility of how you're feeling at work is the work environment. And that also explains how you're feeling. It's not just making you more resilient or happy, but dealing with. Our colleague Sarah Cunningham, who runs the World Wellbeing Movement, she was doing a little sketch on stage at the World Happiness Summit where she was saying, we're going to get there'll be yoga offered between 2 and 3 this afternoon, And at the same time, there's all these Slacks and pings and emails coming in where she was overworked. And so the yoga was actually counterproductive because it had her fall behind and work later in the evening. And so some of these things, these ways of working, the stress, the burnouts, are not going to be addressed by tagging along mindfulness apps or yoga. And these things are not bad, by all means do. But some of the core roots of why we're unhappy at work is come through the structure of work to begin with, and the ways of working and the work itself. And so one intervention, by the way, that does seem to be doing so well is the notion of job crafting. Really there's interventions there where the line manager or the team lead sits together with each one in their team and really runs through. So what are you doing? When are you doing it? Are there ways of improving your ways of working? Providing flexibility throughout the week for you to be able to still do, say, elderly care on Wednesday afternoon, but then pick up some slack on Thursday evening. That would be really well for your work-life balance and still work for the job and somehow make things square the circle for you. So that job crafting bit, where there's sort of a sense of agency and you can craft your schedule in a way, and providing a bit more agency in that process for the worker in collaboration with the team lead. So but that shows you it's not like that's not a mindfulness app. No. That is working to try and do best for the individual and the company doing its best, providing the best possible environment for people to flourish.
Yeah, it's interesting. And for those listening that want to find out more about job crafting, we did do an episode a few years ago with Dan Cable from London Business School, which was all about job crafting, and we talked exactly to your point there, Jan-Emmanuel, about some of the benefits around that. So we talked about HR, an important role that they can play, but not in isolation, as you said, working, collaborating with other areas of the business to try and improve well-being collectively, as you said, not just surface level stuff like mindfulness apps as well. Another big area for HR and business is the future of work. So we can't talk about the future of work without talking about technology, especially AI. What role do you see technology and AI playing in shaping the quality of work, and how can we ensure it's used to enhance rather than erode well-being?
Well, God, how much time do we have? In some, first of all, I'm very pleased. You just noted, how can we leverage these new technologies to improve the quality of work? That is already a massive step change. The fact that you raised the question the way you did is huge, because most people will be generally, especially in the context of policy or economics, they'll be talking about, essentially the supply of work, the quantity, how many jobs will be left? Who's going to be kicked out of the organization? And sort of like, so an element of quantity of work. And as we're being reminded more often than not, is with every industrial cycle, like with major new technology coming in, and what is it now, the fourth and fifth industrial revolution, there's always been a lot of transition, and some jobs go and others get created. And so maybe this time is different through AI, I don't know. But a priori, I think we can probably best rely on the fact that, yes, it'll be difficult. Some jobs will go, transition, reskilling, and then hopefully better jobs will come into play. A priori, the automation, new technology, the AI bit is taking out tasks and jobs that are associated with lower job satisfaction, as was the case in previous industrial revolutions. And so initially, we're optimistic because it means that there will be a period of transition. There needs to be a lot of help for those that are needing to transition. But the new jobs ought to be better than the old jobs. That said, that's the positive case. So from history, extrapolating, there are things that do look different this time around. And AI and these algorithmic platforms becoming your manager to some extent is something that's semi-worrying. I know the talk these days is we've got our co-pilots and our AI agents, and we'll all become CEOs or managers of AI agents. And that seems exciting. That seems to fit with the positive case. But I'm also seeing signals that it's not just AI agents that assist us, but in many cases, it's the AI agents managing us instead. And so maybe not at every level of the organization. Hopefully there'll still be CEOs and C-suite folk bossing AI agents around. But I do see a lot of instances, and the most obviously obvious case are the gig workers who've been, I think, sort of the canary in the coal mine here, potentially. Because if you're an Uber driver or a Deliveroo courier moving food around, you don't have a line manager. Your line manager is an algorithmic platform. You're not seeing other people. You have no colleagues. You have no boss, no nothing. It is algorithmic platforms suggesting where you go, what to do, and whether you're doing a good job or not at it. And so that's a bellwether. We ought to be mindful of that. Now, if in the book we consider all of this and we say it's hard to predict the future, but what we could do is look at the drivers of workplace well-being and how is automation and AI impacting each one of these drivers. And what you're finding is, in essence, some drivers seem to be positively impacted. For example, flexibility, autonomy, agency seem to be agency perhaps less, but flexibility, autonomy. There's more opportunities for job crafting. Working from home is a benefit for the white collar folk typically, but thanks to technology. But then on the flip side, you've got sort of that sense of belonging, which has turned out to be so important. The social elements, those, however, are being put under pressure, especially with algorithmic platforms becoming your manager or your co-workers or Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT. And so that becomes more problematic from a human element, from a well-being, from a quality of work aspect. And then pay is also interesting. Pay, obviously, is important to workplace well-being. And here we do know from economic research on these industrial revolutions is that typically there's gains from productivity, otherwise people wouldn't be doing these technological changes. But the gains from productivity tend to go to a subset of the workers in addition to shareholders and those companies that run these technological advancements. And so our fear is that on one of the drivers of workplace well-being, pay as well. Like, so flexibility positive, belonging, big question. Pay is also questionable because some will benefit, but possibly a majority will not benefit from this. Will have to work harder for the same pay or potentially be in competition with AI and machines, which means that they're going to be having less leverage and bargaining power in driving positive change in their salaries. And so we're foreseeing, and I think all HR leaders listening to this is going to hit home, because as you're introducing these productivity, efficiency enhancing tools, I think it's not talked about, but it's not secret either, and I think we all feel it. The C-suite is very excited about the potential of cost cutting. If we, thanks to these productivity, efficiency enhancing tools, can do more in the same amount of time, that means that teams can be reduced. So if your team, David, now say 10 people strong, I'm willing to put my hand in the fire. In 5 years, it'll be 8 or 6 people strong, and you'll be as productive. And so for a CEO who is very mindful of P&L, people, while they might be a people manager and people are their greatest asset, it's also their greatest cost or liability. Or if they can do without humans, they might prefer that, because humans are erratic and you need to deal with them. There's wants and needs. And so a lot of CEOs may want to be managing an army of robots, frankly, sadly. And so that's an extreme example. We're not going to go there. But you do see, and it's sort of an unspoken element, and I think senior HR leaders are feeling it, that the C-suite is getting excited because they think this will allow us to do more with less people and thus cost cut. Because obviously AI and these automated machines are scalable to no extent, to an extraordinary extent. And so, and at very little cost, unlike adding humans into the mix. So we are going into a space where it's, and the other thing about AI, of course, it cuts across blue collar, white collar, from surgeons or people reading X-rays to people on the work floor in industry. So this is a bit different. It feels a bit different, and it's going to be powerful. Now, if I may end on this, perhaps, is I do think from a political economy perspective, so now from HR to economics to political economy. A political economy is about how to distribute these gains from productivity. Who's going to be who's going to gain from this? And it's definitely going to be the OpenAIs of this world, the Microsofts, the Metas, the Googles, the XAIs. They're going to benefit, and the valuations are already skyrocketing. Think of NVIDIA, etc. So they're going to benefit. I think the employers, the shareholders, are going to benefit massively because there'll be huge efficiency gains, productivity gains. I think the C-suite is going to benefit because they'll have to manage all of this hybrid workforce. And I think the very talented pilots who are really managing this and are good at working with AI are going to benefit. They'll see their salary increases. It's a huge salary. I think there's a big chunk of the workforce who's not necessarily going to benefit. And then the question is, will we be able to redistribute some of these gains from productivity back to the workforce who may not stand to benefit, or a big chunk of the workforce who may not stand to benefit from these gains? And that is through taxation, or through labor unions pushing for decent wages and living wages for people who do not stand to benefit, or through universal basic income, or these kind of ways. And this is the bigger question topics. And then I'll finish on this, but if I'm not fully confident that society will be able to fully compensate the losers in this question and take from the winners enough to compensate the losers through taxation, UBI, etc. And so my idea here is, how about if we cannot compensate or redistribute the productivity gains in terms of money, can we redistribute a little bit in terms of time? So if we can't get it over ourselves to properly tax people and redistribute, the ones that they're winning in this AI race, and redistribute, can we at least give back time? Which then, I mean, this heads towards the 4-day week, or like, I don't know, can we give off Friday afternoon, or can we give back the Wednesday afternoon? Because if we're going to be asking of people to be doing more in the same amount of time, and we're already at the limits of our capacity, and don't forget, AI is huge and will double our productivity, but our brains are still the same monkey brains from before, the hunter-gatherer brains. I see burnouts, mental health, sick days just going through the roof if we're having to do even more than we already have to do today in terms of processing intellectually, or so our cognitive ability to be able to manage these AI agents and become 2-3 times as productive as we already are today. I think we'll have to compensate either by paying people a ton of money, but that will not undo the mental health stress. But even if we're not able to, so even if we're able to pay people tons of money to compensate for the hard work, the productive work they need to do, then I still think we have to give back in terms of time and give people time off. I'm thinking of a Wednesday afternoon or a Friday afternoon, or maybe a whole day at the same pay of the week, of course. So, I mean, know that the weekend was introduced more than 100 years ago by Henry Ford and a few other visionary leaders. I am thinking policy needs to kick into motion. For the sake of well-being and mental health, productivity gains need to be redistributed, not just in terms of decent pay, but also give ourselves the time to digest and relax to be able to be productive those working days. And it's just going to be too much, 5 days at productivity levels that are going to be expected of us.
And maybe we can realize the prediction of John Maynard Keynes from the early part of the 20th century, when he said, I think he said something along the lines of, and maybe I'm misquoting him, something along the lines of by the end of the century, we'll all be working a 15-hour week. I don't think we'll get there, but I think, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that's the well-being angle of the future of work. Jan, we need to get to the question of the series, and then I'm going to ask you one last question about the book. So I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball, and it's probably a little bit of what we've been talking about, really. What's the single biggest shift in the future of work you foresee by 2030, and how do you think HR can lead it?
Oh God, 2030 2030. Okay, so that's 5 years out. That's still manageable, I think.
Yeah, I'm not going to go any further. That's just too hard.
If you say 2050, I mean, all bets are off. I think 2030, the biggest thing for HR is to properly manage the rollout of these new technologies like AI agents.
Yeah.
It's like, don't just impose it and stuff it through people's, stuff it in a sort of like, okay, productivity, efficiency enhancing, this is it, you got to work with this. We have to make this humane and sort of co-create how we want to work with this, because The reason being, and this is a nice distillation of what we've been talking about. Yes, it might be productivity enhancing, but if it takes out a sense of belonging, it's going to hurt people's well-being, which is going to reduce their productivity and raise mental health concerns. And so it may backfire if you push it through too hard just on the sake of efficiency. So yes, CEOs and CFOs will want you to, get this happening ASAP, these AI enhancing tools and Copilot use, but make sure you roll it out in a way that is in partnership with people so they feel good about this, because if they don't feel good about this, it's going to backfire in spectacular ways, and that will undo the productivity gains that you're hoping for, or just ruin people.
Yeah.
So I think it's that. So five years from now, it's about, yes, rolling out these AI efficiency enhancing tools, but in a way that works for people and not just from a technologist's utopia where it's just about turning us into machines as well.
And it's a great opportunity to do something you've talked about earlier in the conversation, A/B testing.
Yeah, exactly.
And see what the impact is on business metrics, people metrics like well-being, and learn from that before you potentially roll it out across the organization.
Yeah, and the way to do this here is, like, rather than introducing a new tool across the board from the get-go, do a staggered rollout, A/B testing, but in a staggered waitlist rollout, like randomly assign it to, say, a third of the business, then 6 months later to another third of the business, and then finally another, and then match it up with well-being, productivity, and see what the impact is on retention. Are people leaving as a result of this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a way of sort of evidence-based policy interventions.
Perfect. Well, yeah, I think we could talk about this all day, but although our listeners like long episodes, I think there's probably, we have to get to a limit. So one thing about the book. So, if people could have one big idea to take away from it, what would you want it to be?
The meta idea, of course, is you take care of people, they'll take care of business. That's the meta idea that comes through. And I know it's what a lot of people say, but obviously the evidence now is irrefutable and it's right there. And the second idea would be measure what you treasure, but measure it properly. Make that conceptual distinction between measuring how people feel and then what drives it, and don't just mix and match things, and it becomes a potpourri of things that becomes ineffective.
Jan, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure, and I've learned a lot from our conversation. Before we part ways for the day, could you let listeners know how they can follow all the great work you're doing at the Wellbeing Research Centre, find out more about the book, follow you on social media?
Oh, well, thank you. I've got a decent LinkedIn following, so look me up on there. The book is called Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters, published earlier this year with Harvard Business Press. It's doing well and sort of really, really brings all of our research together in an accessible way. The Wellbeing Research Centre obviously has a newsletter where there's seminars and much more. The World Wellbeing Movement has we didn't talk about this, but it's very important to note, the World Wellbeing Movement has what we call the playbook for wellbeing interventions. So if you're inspired by everything in the conversation with David just now, and you want to know what actually works to effectively improve workplace wellbeing, look no further than the World Wellbeing Movement's playbook, where for every driver of workplace well-being, we've listed the best evidence-based interventions, and then check out the World Happiness Report.
Lots of resources for people to look at. Jan, thank you so much for being a guest on the Digital HR Leaders podcast.
Thank you, David.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.